Hello and welcome on behalf of ORF. Let me welcome you all to this very special discussion on a book by one of America's preeminent thinkers on Asia, Asian geopolitics, all things Asia, I would say, Micheal Auslin. He's at the moment a distinguished research fellow in contemporary Asia at Stanford University's Hoover Institution. And his latest book, Asia's New Geopolitics, Essays on Reshaping the Indo-Pacific, builds on his previous work, his masterly, The End of the Asian Century. Over the last few years, we have seen Micheal's works actually engaging much more deeply with Asian geopolitics, Asia, Indo-Pacific, what it means for Asia, what it means for the world, and what it means for US strategy in general. So welcome, Micheal. We look forward to you distilling your book in 20 odd minutes for us over the next few minutes. But I would also like to welcome our two discussants. We have a very distinguished set of discussants with us today. Ambassador Saran, former Secretary East and former ambassador to Vietnam, and Shruti Pandalai from Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis, who works on Indo-Pacific and issues related to Asian security. I would also like to encourage you all, whichever platforms you are using, whether Twitter, YouTube, LinkedIn, or whatever, keep sending us your questions, comments, observations, and we'll be taking them as this discussion moves forward. I'll give the floor to Micheal for his initial remarks, for laying out the scene, some of the central questions that he has posed in the book, some of the themes that emerge on Indo-Pacific, a topic that is being widely read and discussed and talked about in India. And then I'll give the floor to the two discussants, and then we can take the conversation forward from there on. So, Micheal, the floor is all yours.
Well, thank you, Harsh, and thank you, Ambassador Saran and Shruti, and of course, everyone who is joining. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you today from Washington, D.C., where I'm located. It's been a long time since I've been back to visit friends at ORF, but all of us who work on Indo-Pacific region issues, whether they're military, security, political, economic, or anything, are of course indebted to the work that ORF does. And all of our at the different research institutes, we're committed, I think, at Hoover, I know, to increasing the contact that we have and the interaction, whether it's virtual, as we have to do today, or hopefully soon again in person. So it's an honor and a pleasure to be here with you and to talk a little bit about this book of essays. And I don't want to take too much time on my end, because I really would like to hear what Ambassador Saran says and Dr. Pandalai, and then just have a conversation. Let me start off by saying it is a collection of different essays, and I think it's important sometimes to move away from both the opinion pieces as well as the monographs, and instead create entire small worlds with essays. And that's really what I tried to do in these 8 essays, where you can tackle a topic that's really indigenous to itself without necessarily having to link it to something larger. And so the essay that I have on the role of Indian women in India's globalization, Japan's encounter with modernity and its attempts to maintain borders against the world, the question of the Sino-Japanese competition for influence in the Indo-Pacific, all of those in many ways stand on their own. But at the same time, there is a theme that runs through the book. It's a theme that I think is reflected in the title, and that is the return of geopolitics. In the United States, at least, after the Cold War, we lost the idea of geopolitics. We lost a geographic sense, in part because we thought it was the end of history. We thought that we didn't really have to worry about global challengers, and therefore thinking about the way that the world might divide into blocks, or that there might be areas of the world in which we would be challenged to maintain a presence. And secondly, what we call, at least in the States, the revolution in military affairs, which really meant that we could now project power around the world without having to think about the geographic consequences. We would talk about precision airstrike and joint air-sea battle without thinking that there were actually geographic constraints on that. And so the result is that we've essentially had a generation that has not thought geopolitically in a rigorous sense, the way that we used to in the Cold War. Obviously, we were very involved primarily in the Middle East, but growing, of course, through that period in the Indo-Pacific as well. I would say that For 20 years, well, roughly 20 years, I would say about 15 years since after 9/11, our focus was almost exclusively on the Middle East. And then at the end of that period, we began, of course, to be much more focused on China, particularly from our perspective as a maritime power in the maritime regions. So the South China Sea, the East China Sea, and of course the Indian Ocean. But we thought about it more as a set. If I can put it this way, we thought about it more almost as a set of annoyances rather than as an integrated strategic challenge. And when I say we, I'm talking a lot about the policymakers throughout the Bush and Obama administrations, and then leading up into the Trump administration. But around 2012, 2014 or so, this began to change, of course, as Beijing expanded its claims throughout the region, particularly its maritime claims, as we watched with increasing levels of uncomfortableness, its growth as a naval power and increasingly as an air power and a space power and cyber as well. As we began to look at policies of Beijing, such as the One Belt, One Road, and of course the older first and second island chains. And it should have been obvious to all of us that what we were facing was a geographic challenge. In a sense, we were facing a geostrategy on the part of Beijing to change the geopolitical environment. I don't think there's any other way to interpret a policy on the part of the Chinese that looked specifically at the first and second island chains, that built islands in the South China Sea, that expanded naval operations into the Indian Ocean, and in fact, created a maritime Silk Road to follow the One Belt, One Road, and the One Belt, One Road itself as a geopolitical attempt to create new networks and linkages throughout the Eurasian land space. So what we faced was the return of geopolitics, and yet being distracted and being convinced that we had still reached the end of history, we had lost the facility to discuss this in a geopolitical sense, the way that Mackinder or Mahan or Spikeman or Huntington would have talked about. So the essays try to recapture that. They do it through history. They do it through looking at the return of geopolitics as it challenges the United States. They do it by looking at the long sweep of America's policy in the region from the 19th century. And if I might note, by the way, for the United States, it was Indo first and Pacific second, because of course we came through the Indian Ocean on our very first trading voyages and didn't reach the Pacific itself until substantially later, both as a trading and as a naval power. So Indo was the first of our focuses in the Indo-Pacific, and we had to begin rethinking that. So I look at the history of that. Chapters that have tried to sum up the region, one called The New China Rules, to look at how Beijing is attempting, as India has faced, to get the world to accede to its demands and its geopolitical preferences. A chapter on North Korea's nuclear program, and why the danger, I think, is not that Kim Jong-un is going to wake up one day and say, I'm going to nuke Delhi or nuke Palo Alto, for example, but rather that maintaining nuclear weapons, what we call the nuclear enterprise, is a very difficult and dangerous operation that we and the Soviets, for example, have had dozens and dozens of accidents during the Cold War and after the Cold War. And we should be very concerned about how the North Koreans will keep their nuclear arsenal safe. As I mentioned, a chapter on the role of Indian women as India attempts to globalize. And then a final chapter, a wrap-up chapter, that is a future history of a war between the United States and China in 2025, a littoral war. Now, just last week, we saw both the United States and China conduct naval exercises, actually naval and air combined exercises throughout the South China Sea. B-52s from the US joined two United States aircraft carrier actually groups, naval and aircraft carrier groups, at the same time that the Chinese were making their own exercises. I think that the danger is not in thinking that Beijing or Washington is planning for war, but rather that in an era of heightened tension, in a region of heightened tension, that an accident or several accidents can happen, that in a condition of lowered trust and distrust, that the two sides could be plunged into conflict. And so the final chapter is a long essay. It's a history of a war in 2025 that begins with accidents in the South China Sea and spirals out into a littoral war in which all nations in the region have to decide which side, if any, that they are on. And the result is a fracturing of the Indo-Pacific into three geopolitical blocks. And so I'm very happy to continue to talk about that. But that chapter is drawn from the headlines. It's drawn from things that have already happened: collisions of aircraft, collisions of ships, of increasingly heated rhetoric between the two sides, and an unwillingness, or an inability, an inability to solve these problems before they become the tinder for a region-wide conflict. So that, in short, is the book. It's the essays. It's the decision on the part of the Chinese to bring back to us, to India, to the United States, to Japan, the challenge of geopolitics, their formation of geostrategy, and in essence, to get us to think about how do we respond so that we maintain what the Trump administration calls a free and open Indo-Pacific, what the United States has essentially aimed for since the 19th century. So with that, I'd like to stop and turn it over to my co-panelists and then to a discussion. And again, just a pleasure to be with you and a pleasure to be with ORF again. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. It's always wonderful to hear from you. Before I turn to the discussants, I have one thing which I would like you to elaborate a bit on, because it's often it does not come across as clearly to outsiders when they look at American political system, American strategic mapping, and how it evolves. What has been quite remarkable is that the shift that we have witnessed in sort of America's China policy in the last 5 to 6 years. I remember you have been always writing very, very strongly about China's rise and how it would impact on America and American interests. But that was also a time when there was another school of thought that was dominant. That there was, you can compare, for example, some of the security strategies that came out a few years back with the contemporary security strategy of the US. So what happened? What changed? Was it primarily China's behavior that became so aggressive that it could not be that there was no other explanation for it, and therefore America had to change its strategy, or that American own assessment of its own vulnerabilities in the region increased? That this perception that America was losing ground in the Indo-Pacific, that the larger its allies and its partners are questioning America's ability to fend for themselves and for itself. So what happened? If you can just elaborate a bit on that sort of evolution, it would be, I think, very interesting for some of our listeners in India.
Thank you. It's a wonderful and important question, and I think it's one that the historians will actually be working on for a long time. I've been trying to write on it. Others have. I'll have a new essay out, I think, this week in Foreign Policy on what I call the age of reciprocity. And that, I think, is really what has happened, is that, if you know the famous neoconservative political philosopher in the United States, Irving Kristol, once said that a conservative is a liberal who was mugged by reality. And I think that's what actually happened to United States-China policy, is that after 40 years of expectations and hopes and attempts to create a working, cooperative, beneficial relationship, that America was actually mugged by reality, that it has woken up to the fact that Beijing has always seen the U.S.-China relationship in a very different way, that whether we talk about economics, we talk about politics, or of course security, that Beijing was never actually going to liberalize or moderate in the way that Washington assumed that it would if we brought it into the international community, if on the economic side we brought it into the WTO, if we created high-level political mechanisms, if, of course, we helped it, even in the early days, build up its military so that it could defend itself better. Instead, over decades of the later period of growth, really the growth in the 2000s and 2010s, what we saw was a Beijing that decided that it was, quite frankly, at odds with much of America's policy in Asia, that it was at odds with much of the world, that it wanted to create its own type of security sphere or its own political relations or its own economic relations. For example, One Belt, One Road. The US side continually hoped that there was an engagement to be had that would find a common ground and would result in a moderation of Beijing's policies. But particularly after 2008, particularly after the financial crisis and the anointment of Xi Jinping as the savior of the party, of the CCP, to recover ground that had been lost after the SARS epidemic and after what seemed like a resurgent America once again acting in the Indo-Pacific region, that it was going to take its own path, and that was a path that would increasingly challenge the U.S. I think what happened around 2015, 16, so by the end of the Obama administration, you had a distinct chill on U.S.-China relations. And I think what you had was what I call the Great Fusion. You had people on the trade side say, you know what, after 40 years, we realized that the trade relationship between the United States and China is not in our benefit anymore. You had people on the security side say, look at what's happened with China Beijing building islands in the South China Sea and militarizing them after promising not to do so. You had people on the I don't know exactly which side you'd put it, a combination of both, that said, look at the cyber espionage that has stolen billions, hundreds of billions of dollars from us, and also intruded into our own private information in the United States. All of this came together on the part of policymakers on both the Democratic side and the Republican side, so that Donald Trump, as he came into office, was actually able to draw on both of these streams, create a great fusion where for the first time he linked the security with the economics and began, as it's hard to remember so long ago, began with the trade policies, what some called a trade war, to attempt to create a new normal where the United States would not simply be at the mercy of an unfair Chinese trading regime. But then that morphed. It morphed quickly into cyber, and then it morphed into security, as we were just talking about, freedom of navigation operations and the like. So I think what happened is that we woke up to the reality. The engagement school, after 40 years, was put on the defensive, and we entered into an age of reciprocity, not to end relations with Beijing, but instead to say they must be reciprocal. They must be fair and even-handed, and this is just the beginning of that, and just the beginning of the new era of U.S.-China relations.
Thank you, Micheal. Let me turn to Ambassador Saran now. Ambassador Saran, your comments on the book, on the wider questions that it raises, and obviously we would also like to talk. We would like you to talk about India's Indo-Pacific strategy, the thinking behind it, and also the fact that are we entering an age of reciprocity vis-a-vis China? Is this something that we are also witnessing, a similar conundrum that America faced? We are also mugged. We have also been mugged by reality. So over to you, Ambassador Saran.
Good evening, good morning to Micheal, and good evening to the rest of you. And thank you very much for kindly including me in this talk. First of all, I'd like to congratulate Micheal for this very interesting book. You call it a collection of essays, called it impressionistic, not comprehensive, but I did find some chapters in it extremely comprehensive, particularly the ones on the US-China relations. And it's interesting to see that now you talk in terms of that relationship as a wake-up reality for USA. Well, it is a wake-up reality for India as well, given what has recently happened and continues to happen, actually. The standoff in Ladakh, suddenly we've been confronted with a very vicious side of China, a China that has failed to adhere to its bilateral commitments that we had been honoring for the last 20, 30 years. So I think it's a wake-up call for all of us. As far as your book is concerned, so really the US-China components were extremely useful for me, gave a very important US perspective at a time when India is also dealing with its own relationship with China and how we deal with that. Of course, you did, because it's a collection of essays, and it's not a book. So clearly, it is. It has its moments, and since you're focused on the heartland instead of the rimland, what you call the Asian Mediterranean, so it's limited just to the inner seas, the three seas that you talked about. Certainly, it neglects the larger Indo-Pacific, and in that, I would say Australia, India definitely come in. But though you have specific chapter on India, I'll come to that later. You have a chapter on Japan and Korea, but I think there were other partners who should have been dealt with as well. For example, I thought, the book neglected the ASEAN countries, Vietnam in particular, Indonesia, Philippines, Taiwan, Thailand. These have been traditional partners of USA since the Cold War. And I don't blame you. I think I'm just giving you some ideas for a full-fledged book. And so to that extent, don't take it amiss. And coming to the India chapter, of course, it's a very important segment and a very important theme. But I was disappointed because, if you call your book Asia's New Geopolitics, naturally, one would have liked to, know more from you about India's role in the regional and the global world order, given India's size. You did say that, did come into it from that USA came into the Indo-Pacific through the Indian route. And if that is the reality, then, and the current reality of India's potential, its military capability, its current relationship with USA and the rest of the world, particularly in the Indo-Pacific, the role that India plays as a balancing factor. And India's commitment to a rules-based international order. So those were some of my points that I thought I must share with you. That said, I have enjoyed reading this collection of essays. I look forward to Shruti's comments as well, but really congratulations. Harsh, moving on to your request to me about speaking on the Indo-Pacific. As far as the Indo-Pacific from the Indian perspective is concerned, the geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific is not just a contemporary development as far as India is concerned. It is very much part of India's historical, its cultural, and its civilizational space. It is visible if you were to visit any part of the Southeast Asian region, or Japan, or Korea, Buddhism, for example, or the monuments, in Siam Reap, the Angkor Wat, Borobudur, anything. I mean, it just smacks of a lot of strong Indian influence, the religions. I mentioned Buddhism, Hinduism, even Islam for that matter. As practiced in Southeast Asia today, has a very strong Indian imprint, the cuisine, the cultural practices, so all of that. So historically, really, India has been a principal player in this spice route between the Indian and the Pacific Ocean. And this was certainly further enhanced while the trade routes got broken up or disrupted during the colonial period. Certainly, the imperial powers did introduce what is called the indentured labor. The Indian diaspora, as you see today, there are about 6 million of them in Malaysia, in Singapore, in Fiji, in the Pacific Islands. All of it started as, part of that colonial move. As far as the Indo-Pacific is concerned and India's positioning, our Andaman and Nicobar Islands are really on the mouth of the Malacca Straits, which provides that very strategic link between the Indian and the Pacific Ocean. And so that is a geographical reality that can't be wished away when it is one of the most important sea lanes of communication. Apart from its historical connections, of course, India has both strategic and commercial interests in the region. While the Indian Ocean, of course, is our natural maritime and strategic space, where 90% of our container trade passes. And within the Indian Ocean, of course, we have been the first responders to any crisis, whether it was the tsunami of 2004, or the water crisis for Maldives, or piracy in high seas, or humanitarian exercises in disaster management. I think India definitely has played that role. As far as the Indo-Pacific is concerned, I think India definitely considers it a continuous space. I already mentioned about the historical perspective, but in contemporary times as well, for us, the Indo-Pacific definitely is a continuous space where 40% of our container traffic actually goes into the Pacific Ocean. 40% of our FDI, 20% going straight to the ASEAN countries. We have very important trade agreements with ASEAN and FTA, also with Thailand separately, but we also have comprehensive economic partnership agreements with Singapore, with Korea, with ROK, with Japan, and others. And so, given the dynamism of that region and India's growth, of course, certainly this year should not be the measure to determine, what would be the growth. This year has been a very unfortunate year, thanks to the Chinese Wuhan virus. But that said, there is a potential, and everybody knows, whether you read an MTAD report or an IMF report, it is anticipated and expected that India will bounce back, and so will the Pacific region, in particular the ASEAN countries. So there is a huge potential there. We have, of course, in recent years, as part of India's Act East policy under the current government, so really basically in the last 6 years, definitely energized our relationship individually, bilaterally with a lot of the countries in the Indo-Pacific region. We have comprehensive and strategic partnerships with Japan, Australia, with USA, with Russia, with Vietnam, Indonesia, and of course with ASEAN. ASEAN, we celebrated just 2 years back, 25 years of our relationship with them. We have, of course, evolved in recent years also several trilateral arrangements, like the India-Japan-Australia, the US-India-Japan, the India-Indonesia-Australia, the Russia-India-China, and of course the Quad. So just to give an idea about the kind of permutations and combinations we are prepared to look at within the Indo-Pacific. As I mentioned, these are really part of our Act East policy. But if you were to ask me today, how do we view the Indo-Pacific? Really, it was outlined very comprehensively by the Indian Prime Minister when he spoke at the Shangri-La Dialogue in June 2018 in Singapore. And really, the crux of what he said was that inclusiveness, openness, and ASEAN centrality and unity were really at the heart of India's Indo-Pacific policy. He stressed that it is not a strategy or a club of limited members. He also emphasized that it's not a grouping that seeks to dominate, and that by no means do we consider it as directed against any country. It is a geographical definition, but definitely that's how we positioned ourselves. The 6 most important elements that Prime Minister Modi outlined during this particular seminal speech on the Indo-Pacific. 1 was a free and open, inclusive Indo-Pacific for a common pursuit of peace and prosperity. 2, an architecture of peace and prosperity with ASEAN's unity and centrality, something I mentioned earlier. 3, it was based on multilateralism, regionalism, and commitment to rule of law. 4, it called for a level playing field for regional and international trade. 5, connectivity and infrastructure was an important element, but it was based on good governance, not the BRI model. Transparency, viability, sustainability, respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity. And 6, an Asia of cooperation, not of rivalry. This more or less, is dovetailed with our own national policy that was articulated a year earlier in Maldives, what is called Sagar, or the ocean, which is security and growth for all in the region. And that is how India has operated within the Indian Ocean bilaterally, whether it is in settling disputes. For example, the one we had with Bangladesh, we went to the court, to the international court. It was not in our favor, but we accepted it and we respected it, and that has been resolved. Or regionally within the Indian Ocean Rim Association, or several other arrangements, or sub-regionally like the BIMSTEC, which is the Bay of Bengal Initiative for Multilateral Technical and Economic Cooperation. Again, it brings together countries from the Southeast and South Asian region. And that has worked well and has been energized in recent years. Moving on to how we look at it with other partners in the Indo-Pacific, I think there is a growing convergence of India's worldview of the Indo-Pacific with the United States, with Japan, where our relationship has taken a completely new turn. Australia, recently we've had a very, very successful virtual summit between our 2 prime ministers, with Indonesia, Vietnam, I mentioned earlier as well, within ASEAN too. and of course, Quad. I think if you were to look at Indo-Pacific today, much like what your book states, I think the Indo-Pacific faces its biggest challenge with China's very aggressive posturing, with its aggressive rise. So it is, that so-called peaceful rise of China, I think, as is not there anymore. Or even this current formulation about a community of shared destiny, a win-win for all. I don't think it's a win-win for anybody except China. Its hegemony, its belligerence, its violation of international laws, notably UNCLOS. You know what they did when the tribunal ruled in favor of Philippines, and they rejected it. They're members of UNCLOS, but they've not accepted it. The militarization of disputed islands, you mentioned that in South China Sea. In violation of a very tacit understanding that they would not do so, or construction of these artificial islands, the features, reefs, shoals, preventing, legitimate economic activity, whether it's fishing, whether it's oil and gas exploration, by littoral states, within their own economic zones. Vietnam, Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, they're all victims of it. Or even, its own illegal, unregulated fishing within other people's territories. Indonesia being, the whole problem with the Natuna Islands and its presence there, its very aggressive presence there. Its presence, its increasing presence within the Indian Ocean, where not only is it kind of sending its navy more frequently, but also its construction of these dual-use ports, the infrastructure, whether you call it in Djibouti or Hambantota or Gwadar or Chakfu, all of these, are threatening. They're threatening smaller countries to toe their line, weaponizing trade. So, that is the China, which is really using its economic heft, its military might, its political influence to coerce, these littoral states to align itself with the Chinese interests. So really, again, to sum up, is if it's a win-win for anybody, it is a win-win only for China. In contrast, if you were to see India's role, you will see that, it has been welcomed by ASEAN, by the other countries in the Indo-Pacific as a balancer, as somebody that respects international laws, that upholds international laws. And so really to ensure a rules-based system in the Indo-Pacific, and how do we deal with the current problem that we all face collectively, it would be important for countries in the region to come together to ensure that we adhere to the international norms, peacefully settle disputes, instead of using force or threat of force, respect freedom of navigation and overflights, and secure the sea lanes of communication. These are some of the elements where I think there's a convergence. Harsh, to respond to your question, where does India and USA's interests converge? I think this is where we both have a very common perspective about respecting and upholding international law, about a common agreement of our strategic partnership, as two democracies committed to a democratic way of governance in international waters, in international space. There have been, of course, partnerships that I mentioned about, trilaterals, quadrilaterals, protecting the sovereignty and territorial rights of the Pacific Island or the smaller countries within the Indo-Pacific. Those are the commonalities, I think, where India, in partnership with USA and other like-minded countries, I think can work together. As far as the differences are concerned, of course, the scope of the Indo-Pacific geographically for India means really from the shores of Americas to the shores of Africa. Whereas USA, I think it's much more limited from the Americas up to India alone. The other difference I perceive in India's understanding of the Indo-Pacific and the American is really the ASEAN centrality, although USA has confirmed that they do believe in ASEAN centrality, but I think the manner in which India has stressed ASEAN's unity and centrality, I think is something that the others must also push for, because this is a group of 10 countries that came together in the wake of the Cold War after a very bloody conflict. And some of them have been traditional partners of USA, some of them have been adversaries. But I think currently they are faced with this divide and rule predicament, the salami tactics, of dividing them for China. That's the policy China follows. And I think in that context, I think ASEAN centrality and unity is something where I think USA should be pushing just as strongly as India does. The East Asia Summit is another one. India is a founder member. USA is a member as well. But I think in recent years, I've seen that the US president, I know that President Trump was there, I think last in 2017, but the US president has not. It's a leaders-led forum where the presence and the leadership of the head of state, head of government, I think really is very important in discussing the regional architecture. And with USA missing at the topmost level, certainly is a vacuum. So, the Indo-Pacific policy misses out something if you have the US president not participating as actively in the East Asia Summit as they have done before. And finally, to counter China's hegemony, apart from, co-opting others, the smaller countries, ASEAN, Australia, Japan, and others, I think it's very important to also co-opt Russia. I know you've had, in recent years, there's been this huge controversy within USA about how to deal with your relationship with Russia. For us, it's been a long partnership with Russia. They are, suppliers of our military hardware as well. They are very important stakeholders in the Indo-Pacific. We forget that. Even in your book, I think I found that one missing. I think a chapter on Russia would help. And I think, Russia too would be, its views count, and they should be definitely, to counter or make the Indo-Pacific a rules-based order. I think this would be one more important country that USA should be working towards. Be happy to share more thoughts, but I think I've already spoken for too long. So thank you, Harsh, and thanks.
Thank you, Ambassador Saran, for a very comprehensive overview of India's understanding of the Indo-Pacific and how India looks at it, when it comes to its engagement with the US in particular. And I'm sure Micheal will have some rejoinders later on. But let me go back. Let me go to Shruti now for her comments on the book. And she has been working on this topic for a while, as well as a researcher who has looked extensively at not only the historical evolution of this concept, but also how it is getting operationalized. So Shruti, anything on the book? You're most welcome to comment on the book, the ideas that it is throwing out. Also, I think some of your own research and how it bears with what Micheal is saying, in the larger context of shifting geopolitics in the region. So over to you, Shruti.
Sure. Thank you, Professor Pant, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and good morning to Dr. Auslin. At the outset, congratulations for such an engaging book. It's been a deep dive, not just in your presentation today, but in the book into dominating discussions really of the Indo-Pacific today. I, of course, take this opportunity to thank Professor Harsh Pant, Dr. Saran, the Observer Research Foundation for having me. It's an honor and privilege to be part of this very distinguished panel, especially coming to speak after Ambassador Saran, who has given such an expansive exposition, which will be tough to follow up. I think it's difficult really to do justice to a book this expansive in a few minutes, but let me start with a confession, and I told this to Dr. Auslin before we started this chat, that as I started with a chapter provocatively titled India's Missing Women, and I found myself visibly nodding to your assessment that for India to succeed globally, it will have to empower women more substantially. I think we've made some progress, and as you have rightly pointed out that, things are changing, though unevenly. Let me also say we've been, having a lot of discussion recently within the strategic community on social media platforms of gender diversity on panels. And I'm glad to see that this discussion seems to be on the right side of that debate. So thank you to all of you. Quickly, to jump back to the topic of discussion, I'm really grateful for this opportunity to read Dr. Auslin's book, which truly simplifies for me very lucidly exceedingly complex strategic debates, and it offers a historian's lens to help you connect the dots, and I think that's very important. For me, I think at this point of time, after Ambassador Saran's sort of exposition, what I could do would, to draw out Dr. Auslin on, the India question, especially from an Indian point of view when I'm reading his book, on a few issues that stood out to me and invite his perspectives on it. These are, of course, in no particular order. Ambassador Saran already mentioned the issue of the focus on the Asiatic Mediterranean, and you have argued from the US perspective this is important to achieve cohesion in strategy, where you say rather than focusing on the Indian and Pacific Oceans, the US instead should consider the Sea of Japan, the East China Sea, and the South China Sea. To my mind, this assertion actually really falls into line with what New Delhi has been saying for a long time, as to the concept of the Indo-Pacific is really a work in progress conceptually. It's neither, it's not a top-down structure or clearly defined block approach that would draw into it all sub-regions under a particular framework. So, from Indian point of view, as the ambassador noted, it comes from a realization that India will naturally play a key role in the involving Indo-Pacific, given its geographical location, our vast coastline, and an array of island territories. And as the ambassador mentioned, 95% of India's trade moves by sea, including its large imports of oil and gas. So really for us, a free and Indo-Pacific vision is based on it being inclusive of and on shared interests and values. And here, like where your interests are in what you call the Asiatic Mediterranean, for us, the primary, of course, concern lies in the Indian Ocean region. We ourselves have, over a period of time, expanded our imagination of the Indo-Pacific region to encompass not merely the region stretching eastwards from India, which would have been the ASEAN as the central focus. India now actively advocates about incorporating the Western Indian Ocean and Africa, like the ambassador had pointed out. So I agree with your assessments that, in your words, that we are sort of vastly expanding our battlefields. But I think there's also represents a churning in our respective capitals that now, like in the case of India, we have to work on implementing two sets of distinctive policies. For example, like the Act East and the Act West as part of India's Indo-Pacific strategy. So when Matthew Pottinger comes here to Raisina and says that his definition of the Indo-Pacific region spans from California to Kilimanjaro, the interpretation to me seems to be that it's not really a binary choice, but an imagination of an integrated Asia that you talk about. It is also predicated on the understanding that it's an evolving concept and has varied interpretations among countries in the region. And as like-minded countries work together to narrow differences, common convergences will emerge. So really, it's a matter of cooperation, not so much cooperation, rather coordination of cooperation that we are really talking about. And for me, really, the evolution of the concept has been very organic and ongoing, because now you have our external affairs minister talking about the India way in the Indo-Pacific. And I feel that, we've come a long way, and this is the discursive evolution that is happening in all like-minded countries in the region. And I'll invite your views on that. Then, of course, it's a conversation that constantly happens in New Delhi when I'm talking about it from an Indian perspective on the Indo-US relationship, is that, the momentum of the India-US relationship is very fundamental in terms of its impact on the Indo-Pacific conversation. So while there's no refuting the broadening scale of depth of relationship that New Delhi and Washington share, especially after our Prime Minister has come out with a very powerful evocation where he says that countries are overcoming hesitations of history. And even now, after the bloody clash in the Himalayas, we've seen a lot of discussion within India, of course, on, how this will push for a closer or continued alignment with the US, especially deepening of our defense cooperation, and including some suggestions, as the ambassador had mentioned, about how India has the potential to either stoke or assuage the anxiety over the Malacca Strait dilemma with like-minded nations. My Director General has written a fairly long issue brief on the same, saying that there are all sorts of possibilities that exist on the table with like-minded countries in the region. Now, these are all, I feel that these are conversations that were happening, but now we've had the push to discuss them more openly. However, while all of this is happening on one side, there is also an acknowledgement that the border altercation has brought home the message that, China is viewing this bilateral relationship with India through an increasingly, distorted lens of great power relationship of the United States. So, this is increasing consequences for India in terms of the strategic calculus. And then to add to this is the complicated nature of the India, US, and China relationship. For example, Tanvi Badan has written a fantastic book called Fateful Triangle on this, and she seems to argue that the India-US relationship has always depended on variables around China, and that is to say, partnerships are strengthened when China appears to pose a threat. But however, only when they agreed on the nature of the threat, the urgency of the threat, and how to deal with that threat. When they disagreed on this threat perception and what approach to take toward China, the differences had an adverse impact on the relationship. And as you point out in your book, and like Harsh asked you a little while ago, that the consensus on this and the fundamental shift of view started in the US in the 2000s, and there's an emerging consensus that has happened over the last 3 odd years. But for India, really, China has been a problem since the 1950s. I mean, I was also reading a paper by Joshua White at the Brookings Institution, which goes on to talk about this India factor. And he says that if indeed the United States is interested in sustaining a wager on India in an increasingly interconnected and polarized Asia, it will have to confront not only the challenge of managing India's anxieties about American reliability, but also reorienting the American bureaucracy to deal with a changing region. He sort of goes on to draw on from primary documents, etc., to argue that the US bureaucracy has long been structured in a way as to heavily compartmentalize policy decision making related to South Asia and East Asia, with a pronounced bias structurally towards East Asia. And so there have been relatively few matters that have risen since 2005, which have forced the United States to consider a trade-off between India and China equities. So that now becomes a challenge sort of in an increasingly interconnected Indo-Pacific region. I'll invite your thoughts on this as well. Like I told you before we started this discussion, for me, the chapter on China's news rules couldn't have been written better, especially for someone who works on sharp power contestations. I couldn't agree more when you say that apart from making the business community sort of globally cower to its demands, China is also offering to implement new ideas and institutions with a well-crafted propaganda campaign that shifts from intimidation and, like you sort of provocatively suggest, to seduction. So we have sort of seen that in South Asia, where there's a systematic cultivation of political elites. I had a colleague at IDSA who used to talk about the geopolitics of Buddhism when he looked at the Belt and Road project and stuff like that. So I think that, there are, so for the Indo-US relationship particularly, we have seen successes in trying to sort of coordinate a pushback on these when we talk of working together on issues like connectivity. So when you, for example, raise the topic of the Sino-Japanese competition in terms of the ADB versus the AIIB framework, I thought I would, point out a little bit also towards India's agency from inside as well. So while you're right about its lesser share in veto powers, Ambassador Saran might agree with me here that, we had a foreign secretary who said that as a founding member of these new institutions, India is playing a role to ensure that best practices learned from existing multilateral development banks and financial institutions are practiced by new bodies. So therefore, by India welcoming financing from China-led institutions, we're also sort of shaping, as Samir and Akhil and others have called, shaping sort of China's or responding to China's misbehavior. Now, just to sort of quickly bring in the Indo-US relationship in the context of the connectivity debate, which is very central to our convergences in the Indo-Pacific, I think what India has been increasingly trying to do is to double down on its expertise in project planning and assist industry in projecting itself as a visible and a viable, technologically sound partner for developing nations in diverse sectors. So when the US Deputy NSA, Matt Pottinger, at the Raisina Dialogue talks about the Blue Dot Initiative, I think a lot of ideas have come forth where you're saying that, with the US Build Act, the ARIA initiative, etc., things like blue dots could be given to Indian companies who, along with American companies, can deliver clean, sustainable projects overseas. So, there are coalitions of the willing coming together in terms of the pushback. In the context also of the dynamics of the India, Japan, and US relationship, Ambassador Saran has spent a fair amount of time on with the various bilateral, trilateral, and plurilateral dialogues. But just to quickly, I wanted to ask you, how do you think, when there's a lot of conversation building, how India is becoming an important variable in the geopolitical churning that is influencing the Indo-Pacific discourse both in Washington and Tokyo? So how are you viewing this dynamic in terms of responses in this region? And I completely, I'm going to end here because I know there are a lot of questions which are going to come to you. But when you say that not standing up to China's intimidation now will have much higher costs in the future, you couldn't be more prophetic, because we've seen fluidity in strategic behavior to push back in the recent past. And as Dr. Raja Mohan put it, that India's resistance to China's expansionism would be a definite moment in Asia's geopolitical evolution. So for me, given all of this and the emerging coalitions and congruences in all of our relationships, for me, your scenario in the final chapter where the non-aligned bloc led by Russia and India take advantage of the trifurcation of East Asia to advance their interests, do you continue to stick with that sort of prognosis, or do you think the variables are changing now in the current dynamic? I'll stop here, and thank you once again to Dr. Auslin for such a fantastic book, and thank you, Harsh, for the opportunity.
Thanks, Shruti. Micheal, I think perhaps you can respond to some of the points that Ambassador Saran and Shruti have made. And also let me add, because we have limited time, and I would like to add a few questions from our other participants who are observing this on various platforms. And I think one of the questions which has often been posed in the Indian context as far as the US-China relationship is concerned is this hang of G2. This question is often asked: how serious is this potential antagonism? After all, superpowers, great powers have always this incentive to come to terms with each other at an opportune time. So can that Obama moment, which was very short-lived in the initial stages of Obama administration, but it cast a very long shadow, I think, in a number of conversations. For example, in India, you often hear that even today. Is there a possibility at all in the present context, and given how far the US-China relationship has evolved, what sort of convergences do you see there? If there is any constraints left, for example, who can viably make that sort of an argument in the present context? I think that is something that there's a lot of that there'll be a lot of interest in understanding that conundrum. The other issue is, and I think Shruti touched upon it. Also, you talk of this contestation between two models, China model, Japan model. Is there an India model there? Is there something that India can present itself as a model? I mean, I think there have been various arguments being made that China is so antagonistic towards India because more than any other nation, India presents a viable alternative, a democracy that is also doing very well in terms of economic development. Given its internal challenges, it continues to stand up to China despite all the problems. So I think is there an India model there that perhaps one can look at? And finally, for the first round, and I will also take this to Ambassador Saran, there's a lot of interest in the Quad and the viability of Quad. So Micheal, how do you see this quadrilateral initiative evolving? And I would take this again to Ambassador Saran as well later. And how does she see that in the present context? Will India move forward more vigorously with this? Or will this, one step forward, two step backward strategy continue? So Micheal, the floor is all yours.
Well, thank you. First of all, thank you so much to Ambassador Saran and to Professor Pandalai and the comments, far more extensive than my own comments. So I truly appreciated hearing them. And so many different questions. I'm glad that I was never across the negotiating table from Ambassador Saran, as she pointed out some of the gaps in the book. And again, not to defend it, it was a book of disparate essays, and I think actually a good number of the questions that she raised, I probably touched more on in my previous book, The End of the Asian Century, including, most importantly, I think the two main points that she raised: the role of Southeast Asia and of ASEAN, and then the role of India. Even though I do think that there are certainly, while I fully agree that the 50-year history of ASEAN in terms of creating networks and structures of interaction throughout the region, obviously focused initially on Southeast Asia and then expanding out, really is sort of the core of how you create community. I looked back then particularly at sort of limitations and looked at things like the Rohingya crisis and other things that showed that the limitations even after those 50 years, without denying the importance of it. And I think that when you've seen Washington have, over the past 2 decades now, join in or attempt to join in on these different initiatives that have come out of ASEAN, as you've seen Japan attempt to join in. Obviously, you had ASEAN +6. You've had it's expanded into East Asia Summit and the like. And I think in many ways outstripped APEC. It just has a different feeling from what I see APEC doing. That it becomes clear that this really is in many ways the cockpit of regional diplomacy, and that is exactly where it should be. And I can't agree more that without the highest level American participation, there are gaps there. And I say that not because America necessarily can or should dominate those gatherings, but rather because as an important player in the region, then we need to be at those gatherings. So I fully agree with that. Wow, so many different questions, and I just want to try to touch on a few of them. On the question of the G2, because I think it gets to this larger issue of where we will go in terms of perceptions of the relationship between Washington and Beijing, and then expand that out into perceptions of the relationship between New Delhi and Beijing, or Tokyo and Beijing. We had 40 years of the hopes that eventually we would get to something like this G2. And I think all different countries had that. I think if you look to Tokyo, they had their hopes as well, that there would be this understanding that the cooperative nature of the relationship would help structure many of the problems that Japan, for example, was facing. And I would think that India, in its own way, certainly when we saw early on BRIC arguments and the like, also made the assumption that Beijing would become an increasingly constructive partner, and none of that has really come to the fore. And so the G2. Well, look, let me start with the first political reaction, which is that if former Vice President Biden is elected president in November, then I think you will see a resurgence of the engagement school. I think that the people around him have, first of all, committed their professional careers to it. I think that dispositionally, it's how they view relations between the United States and China, and that you will see this reversal of what President Trump has done. Now, to some degree, I don't think you can unwork everything that has been the focus on the Trump administration. I think on the trade policies, for example, this was really driven by the Democratic side in the U.S., was to make the trade policies more fair because it worked against U.S. workers and the like. So I think that there will be pressures on a Biden administration, but for the most part, I think you will see the rhetoric shift very dramatically back towards cooperation. And I think, quite honestly, that's going to be a mistake. I think that Beijing has perfected the art of telling us what we want to hear while pursuing its own policies. And I think for 40 years it has done that, so that it will look with anticipation towards a Biden administration that's going to be saying all the right things, and it will be reciprocated by Beijing saying all the right things, and that the U.S. is going to lose more and more ground. I think we will lose ground on the One Belt, One Road. The blue dot will probably just be passing into history. I think we will lose ground in the seas. I think we will lose ground on cyber and the like. So, pardon me, I'm actually quite worried about that. Sorry about that. On the question of the Quad, I think the time has come. I think it's very clear that an initial Quad that was proposed back in the in the mid 2000s, the time was not ready. But I think the time is ripe now for a new Quad, and a new perception that the Quad is necessary, not because we want an adversarial relationship with China, but because the cooperative structures and mechanisms that we hope we would see have not developed. Let me turn the question around just a little bit. The big argument we have today in the United States is, is there a new Cold War with China? And it's often asked, are we in a new Cold War, or is the US pursuing a Cold War strategy? And I think that gets the question backwards. The real question is, does Beijing believe it's in a Cold War with us? And I think the answer to that is yes. And it shows that through its actions. And I think at this point is where we have to start being very careful to once again talk about ideology and talk about the role of the CCP. Under Xi Jinping, the CCP has shrunk the sphere of civil society in China that so many of us engaged with colleagues in their universities or in their think tanks or in their non-governmental organizations. The CCP has also shrunk the sphere of government in China, putting the party back on top of the government, reversing the reforms or the evolution, if we want to call it that way, of the Deng Xiaoping and Jiang Zemin era. So that when we talk with government officials in Beijing today, they are often thinking first and foremost about their party role rather than their government role. That Xi Jinping has doubled down on, for example, the role of ideology, whether it's document number 9 or others. So these are all the ways in which the way that we thought we might have a G2, or we thought we might have this larger cooperative relationship, themselves have been undermined by actions that Beijing has freely taken. I'm not even talking about the coronavirus that began in Wuhan. We just found out, of course, that it never even informed the WHO, the World Health Organization, about the virus, but that the WHO found out about it through the internet. So the point is that all of these presumptions that we made about how Beijing would act as it integrated with India, or it integrated with Japan, or integrated with the United States, have all been shown to be false. Because of that, then, the idea of the G2, I think, no longer has any salience, no matter how much a Biden administration might try to recreate it. I think, conversely, then, the idea of the Quad, of countries that share an understanding of how would you put it? I mean, I don't want to just say that's because we're democracies, but I think that is important, that India, Japan, Australia, the United States, because we share certain values, and because we share certain values about transparency, openness, rule of law, and norms, have increasingly come together and should explicitly and consciously come together further. And then finally, let me just mention the question about China versus Japan model, and is there an India model? It was an essay that I had written before, and yes, much of the book has an East Asian focus, but in part that's because the United States has had an East Asian focus, and what I want is for us to have a broader Indo-Pacific focus of the type that Shruti was talking about, or the type that the ambassador was talking about, because our own human capital on the broader Indo-Pacific is just thinner. Because of our alliance systems, we focused on the East Asian element, and even not Southeast Asia that well. So once we left the Philippines in the early 1990s, we sort of lost the competency to talk about Southeast Asia, but we maintained alliances with India, with Japan and South Korea. And so those were the alliances we were used to talking about. Those were the responsibilities we were used to talking about. We need to broaden that. We need to broaden it in our academics. We need to broaden it in government. I think as Shruti brought up, we sort of divided up between East Asia and Southeast Asia and South Asia. It all needs to be integrated. It is an integrated strategic space, as Ambassador Saran was talking about. And so the argument about a China versus a Japan model was one that Americans might understand a little bit better, because we're familiar still with the role that Japan played for so long in the global economy, and quite frankly still plays. The role that India plays, the India model, is something that we in the United States are far less familiar with. And so part of writing a book of essays like this is actually to draw attention to what has not been said and what has not been thought of in terms of our policy. And that's why these types of conversations, I think, are crucial and need to inform our policymakers going forward. I think it will I would just say, though, that I am concerned about where a Biden administration will go. I think it will be long on rhetoric and short on achievement. I think it will be long on talking about our relations with Beijing are just as important as our relations with New Delhi or our relations with Tokyo. And I think that will fundamentally misread the strategic situation, misread the geopolitical challenge, and quite honestly, play precisely into Beijing's hands so that it will get the type of rhetorical boost that it has found wanting over the past 3 years.
Thank you, Michael. Can I invite Ambassador Saran to talk about the Quad, if possible, and India's engagement with this model, and whether in the current context we do see this moving forward in a more robust direction.
Yes, I completely agree with Michael. I think Quad definitely is an important forum. It started off modestly at an official level, but yes, there has been a meeting at the foreign ministers level too. And once again, I agree with Michael that, democracies, it's not just a cliched term that we should be using, but, when you talk about democracies, it's important to bear in mind that when democracies come together, they are very mindful about public opinion, which is why when democracies come together, what the people want. And so to that extent, I think coming together of a partnership of 4 major democracies in the Indo-Pacific is very important. Also because all of these countries would be able to ensure or would represent a rules-based order, a respect for a rules-based order of international laws that have been put together by all of the countries in the region. Now, of freedom of navigation, of securing the sea lanes of communication. So for those reasons, I think Quad definitely in the current context is bound to have a larger salience. And I think it should.
Thank you, Ambassador. So I have a few questions, perhaps for the last round, where I will invite all 3 of you to comment briefly and to make your concluding remarks as well. But there are a couple of questions, Michael, about this trade and technology decoupling. So there is a question which I think all of us have been grappling with. To what extent is this decoupling possible in this day and age, in this era where clearly global supply chains are what they are, and given over the last 4 decades almost, US and China in particular have been almost partners in arms in creating the trade, global trade infrastructure. So where do you see this discussion going over the next 3 to 5 years, and whether with or without Biden administration, and does this become a real possibility for America, given the kind of strategic priority it has been made out to be? There are, I think, some people are also asking about, a question about China and why is it that China is opening so many fronts at the same time? I think this is a question that is quite baffling from a perspective. But I think if you have any insights into this, it would be quite interesting to share. And finally, there is this, ASEAN. We have talked a lot about ASEAN, and clearly there is a discussion about that ASEAN has not been robust enough to challenge China's growing might. So there is, perhaps, is there a possibility there that India and the US together can work in making sure that ASEAN has that agency or retains that agency and space to make more robust claims vis-a-vis China? Is that a possibility, or is this something that won't happen given the structural challenge that we face in the region? I'll invite Michael, Ambassador Saran, and Shruti to intervene, to interject, as well as make their concluding points, so that we can wrap up in the next few minutes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Michael.
Yes, I'll try to be brief because those are excellent and important questions. On decoupling, I actually think decoupling is healthy. Now, when I say that, I don't mean that the United States is going to completely separate from China. That's impossible. But what we've actually seen over the past 40 years has been an unbalanced development in the global trading network and supply chains and manufacturing space, which is that it has so overwhelmingly been focused on China that other countries, particularly those in Southeast Asia, have not been able, and I would say India to some degree, have not been able to take as much advantage. as we expected them to be able to under globalization. And this, of course, I defer to Ambassador Saran, but when I was in Vietnam talking with the Vietnamese, how much they talked about their desire to play a larger logistics role and a larger manufacturing role. Same thing in Malaysia, same thing in other countries, and it's been too difficult. So my first point is that diversification of global supply chains, of trading networks, of logistics and the like, would actually be a healthy thing to reduce the dependence that we have on China and allow other countries to begin moving up the value-added chain. I think that's very important. There are strategic reasons as well, of course, the vulnerabilities that we now understand, which are inherent in being so dependent on China under globalization because of the virus that began in Wuhan. We need to make sure that we reduce our vulnerabilities, whether it's the ability to develop medicines, protective personal equipment, expand it to things like rare earths, which are so vital for our economies as well. So that what I think we should be having is both the discussion about and planning for a strategic decoupling. Not that we decouple everything, because that makes no sense and would be very disruptive, but that we identify the areas where we do need to decouple, as I mentioned, medicines, personal protective equipment, rare earths, and the like, and begin both to find other partners around the world. And that is going to be expensive. It's going to be somewhat disruptive, but I think it's necessary. But also for the United States, that we bring some of that back home, as I think many countries should try to do. So I'll leave the decoupling there. I think it's a very important question. We could talk a lot more about it. Very interesting question on why is China opening up so many fronts. I think we will look back on the era of Xi Jinping as an era of overreach on the part of China and Beijing. And I think it's actually a combination of a couple different factors. One, I think, is the fruits of so many years of development, so that there is an arrogance on the part of Beijing, certainly after 2008, when it felt it handled the financial crisis better than the United States, that the West's time at the center of global development was over, and certainly the United States was over. That Japan continued to seem to sort of flail about, and India was sort of up and down. And so that in some ways, the party felt this was the ripe time to create a world safe for China, safe for the party, by discounting or undermining the idea of liberal democracy and of open free markets and the like, and that instead you would create a world more favorable to authoritarianism. But at the same time, I also think it was due to a sense of weakness on the part of the party in Beijing, the feeling that time is not on its side. That its demographic slowdown, its macroeconomic slowdown, its environmental issues, its gender issues, its ethnic issues over Uyghurs and like, all of this was creating drags on China. And that, in fact, you had to act now to open up your new fronts, because you might not be able to do it in 10 years or 15 years. And that's why we've seen what we've seen in the South China Sea, or maybe in Ladakh and other areas. So I'll leave that one as well, because that we could talk about that a lot. And as for ASEAN, again, I would very much defer to Ambassador Saran, to Shruti, but I would just say that in my prior book, The End of the Asian Century, I did propose something I called the concentric triangles, which was a way to link the large nations in the Indo-Pacific, India, Japan, Australia, and then the United States as an external but very involved actor, with the smaller nations, and particularly focused on ASEAN. And I talked about Vietnam, I talked about Malaysia, Singapore, and even the Philippines as countries where we should be working together to develop capabilities, to develop capacity, to develop norms and standards, much of which ASEAN itself has tried to do, but I think with a more explicit focus on the role that the large countries can play in helping set conditions in which the smaller countries can have confidence of their access to the global commons, confidence of their access about, for example, rules of the road and norms and the like. And that's still something I think could be potentially valuable. But again, I'll leave it there for my colleagues to talk about.
Thank you, Micheal. Ambassador Saran?
Thank you, Harsh. Yes, I completely agree with everything that Micheal has said, so I will not repeat those. But very quickly, because I'd be very happy to hear what Shruti has to say on all of these 3 points. As far as decoupling is concerned, apart from everything that Micheal said, it's very important to diversify also from the Indian perspective. It makes no sense ever to put all your eggs in one basket. 2, it's becoming increasingly an adversarial relationship. And so why should we bankroll an adversary? Why should we allow ourselves to be dependent upon, it's almost like a dependence on drug abuse or substance abuse, that you get used to these cheap Chinese goods, which decimates your own manufacturing capacity, particularly in strategic sectors like, the telecom or pharmaceuticals. So if we can diversify those chains and become self-sufficient, I think that should be our priority. If you were to look how, our trade imbalance with China, $60 billion. So annually, we are actually bankrolling one CPEC, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, every year because of this trade imbalance and deficit that we have. So certainly we should move out of those clutches of anything that is not in our interest. Finally, on ASEAN, yes, they would need support. Their unity and I think centrality is important. I think I made that point earlier, so I will not repeat that. We must also remember that, the ASEAN countries, both collectively and individually, are extremely dynamic countries. They have done exceedingly well. Look at the way Vietnam dealt with the Wuhan virus. They've had no casualties and just a few cases, which they were able to contain very quickly. Some of them are extremely exemplary in their growth models and their growth stories. There's a lot that we can learn, even as we learn to support them and work with them. There is a lot that we can do in partnership with them. And so I think that is where the role of the bigger countries in the Indo-Pacific, in partnership with ASEAN, which has tried against all odds to maintain its identity as one collective whole of 10 very disparate countries which were on different sides of the Cold War, have come together. And so to that extent, I would give a lot of primacy to that, which is what we maintain repeatedly, therefore, that ASEAN centrality and unity is foremost in this whole Indo-Pacific strategy that India follows. Thank you.
Shruti, you have the proverbial last word, but don't take too long because we have run completely out of time. So
no, I think Ambassador Saran and Micheal have answered basically all the questions. So for me, it's left to say that, this question of the trade and technology decoupling, we've had to sort of address it in terms of how we address the rising techno-nationalism, and we sort of are trying to conceptualize solutions to the 5G debate. So I think it's, we understand for India, I read a report which said the economic impact of 5G for us is at $1 trillion. So we understand that the choices that we make will impact how we, take advantage of the first flush in terms of innovators and so on and so forth. So it's like Micheal said, the strategic decoupling would be the model to follow. So when we're talking about China +1 strategies, or we're talking about, things like how gated globalization, a concept that Samir and colleagues at ORF have put, sort of trading within countries where political and strategic trusts exist, perhaps is the way forward. Quickly, to come to the question of ASEAN centrality, I think, in our institution, we've had lots of debates on this. And I think the emerging consensus is that the ASEAN centrality question is a double-edged sword. Now, what the ASEAN requires from us is a larger buy-in. And I think India and the United States can collectively come together and give them that. So I'll stop here and thank you once again to all of you for such a splendid discussion.
Well, thank you, Ambassador Saran. Thank you, Shruti, for being very gracious and taking your time to read the book on a short notice and to comment on the book. Thank you, Micheal. It's always a pleasure to listen to you, to read you. So keep writing. We look forward to your next book. But in the meanwhile, please keep in touch. And it was a wonderful 1.5 hours we spent together. And this discussion perhaps is never ending. It will continue because the whole idea of Indo-Pacific is still evolving. So thank you all, and it was wonderful to have you all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.